Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome back. I see people are filing into the virtual room here, and so I will continue to welcome folks as the room fills up. I think I just am sort of, I won't say overwhelmed, is maybe, no, it's not too strong of a word. Really, it was a marvelous panel. The scope of the work that is being done, the level of partnership we have at the state is really remarkable, and it was really nice to hear that dialogue between some of the local needs and some of the dynamic tension between that and what the state is providing. We're hoping with this next panel that we will build upon some of what we heard about more theoretically about fair housing, some of the nuts and bolts of how do we actually effectuate that here in the city of San Diego. And we've got a great panel to do that. I will remind folks, please do your surveys at the end of the session. Those are invaluable for us. Also, our sponsors want to know, if they're reaching folks. And I will take a moment to thank those sponsors one more time. Of course, our co-producing sponsor is the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing. I'm Steve Russ with the San Diego Housing Federation, co-producer, the San Diego Housing Commission, Citibank, and the California Housing Finance Agency, or CalHFA, are all sponsors, and we appreciate their support for this program. So in order to build upon this, we have one of the foremost experts in housing in town. He's very modest, and so he's going to be cringing as I say these really kind words about him. But our moderator is the president and CEO of Habitat for Humanity, a former board member for the San Diego Housing Federation. Well, actually, former, and once again, he's now again a board member here. And former program director over at LISC San Diego, also worked at the LISC National and the Housing Commission. Man is extremely talented. I'm proud to call him a friend. And I'm really pleased that he is here to guide us through this next session. With all of that, I'd like to introduce Kwafi Reed to moderate our session. Kwafi.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I was indeed cringing in my chair, horrified as you said all those very nice things. This panel that we've managed to put together, I think, is really reflective of the kind of intellect and effort that we're going to need to try to solve some of these challenges. It's a panel that combines both some of our local philanthropic leadership that is looking at new and innovative ways to really try to tackle these long-running and historic challenges, and it also brings together an academic and sort of a data-driven review of sort of where we are in terms of granting access to sort of the dream of affordable home ownership for so many of the communities that we're trying to serve. So with that, I'd like to introduce our two panelists. I'm going to do it in reverse order of how you're going to be hearing from us. As Steve mentioned, my name is Kwafi Reed, and I'm the president and CEO of San Diego Habitat. I'll be talking a little bit more about sort of the work that we do a bit later. But before that, I'd like to introduce you to the other two folks who you will be hearing from. Second in the list is going to be Pamela Gray Payton. She is the Vice President and Chief Impact and Partnership Officer at the San Diego Foundation. They are taking new and innovative steps into trying to solve some of these access issues that we've been having, both in terms of the investments in their areas of focus. Prior to her role at the San Diego Foundation, she has taken on similar work both at San Diego, University, and as a and as the board president of RISE and at the Kim Center for Social Balance. So she's got a wealth of experience in this area. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Pamela to the panel. Pamela, if you could turn your camera on and we could all get a look.
I'm sorry. Good morning. That should not be so complicated at this stage of Zoom, but hi, Kwafi. Thank you so much for having me, and welcome to all of you. It's great to be here. And we're going to, am I giving a brief overview at this point, or we're going to come back?
We're going to introduce Emmanuel, and then we're going to have him kick off with his presentation.
Terrific.
All right. And then the second person I'd like to introduce is Emmanuel Martinez. He is a data reporter who's been working for many years from an investigative perspective on some of these issues around both fair housing and social equity. He spent several years at the Markup, and while he was there, he has really gathered together an impressive list of accolades. He is a winner of the George Foster Peabody Award and the Selden Ring Award for investigative journalists. And in 2019, he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. More than all of that, he really brings together a wealth of information about how some of these outcomes that some of these disparate outcomes that I think we've all been experiencing in the context of affordable housing, and really, I think the financial access to that dream of home ownership have really kind of come about from a data perspective. So with that, I'd like to welcome Emmanuel, and so that he can say hi as well. Hi there, Emmanuel. Emmanuel, you're on mute, which is the plague of our age.
Also, shouldn't be this hard. I'm with Pamela. Shouldn't be this hard at this stage of our Zoom lives. But thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here and talk about the work.
Very exciting. Very, very good. So if you all would like to maybe give a brief overview of sort of what you'll be talking about, that would be just fine. Or we could just kick off and have you start up your presentation, Emmanuel. It's sort of up to you.
Yeah, so I've been covering, so my entry point to housing is specifically through home ownership and the impact that redlining has continued to have on the country and the access to home ownership, and then what that means for building wealth and the racial wealth gap that exists in this country. So I will be giving an overview of the work that I have done over the past 5 years working with federal mortgage data to show the disparate impacts that still exist today.
Very, very good, Emmanuel. I think that's going to be super interesting. And how about for you, Pamela? What do you think you'll be going over today?
We'll be talking about the San Diego Black Homebuyer Program, and I understand the attendees have heard a bit about that already from Ricardo over at LISC, but we'll dive a little deeper into the background of why we started the program, what we've been able to accomplish so far, and where we hope to see it go in the future.
Very exciting. So, you know, as I mentioned, I think we have a real mix here of sort of a practical, sort of forward-looking set of strategies and like approaches, and also kind of a data-driven sort of examination of perhaps where we are and sort of what things we can be helpful with or sort of change. With that, I'm going to just talk a little bit about sort of what our format is going to be. Each of our panelists, including myself, is going to give a brief presentation. Emmanuel is going to start us off, and he's going to do, I'd say, sort of the bulk of sort of our kind of our look at sort of our current state of affairs. Pamela, as she mentioned, is going to be talking a little bit about sort of how that Black Homebuyer Program is sort of rolling out, and sort of what the kind of hopes are for sort of the impacts that it'll have. And then I'll be talking a little bit about sort of how Habitat has been working in and around this space, you know, facing some of the same challenges that we all have been working on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emmanuel and let you get started with your presentation. And at the end, we will have some time for some questions and answers from the audience. But with that, Emmanuel, why don't you get us started?
Yeah. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick, and then let me know if you can all see that. Can you all see that okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so like I said, I've been working on looking at housing issues of home ownership, redlining for the last 5, 6, 7 years or so, primarily focusing on through a data-driven aspect. And something from I produced like 2 major investigations on this, and something. The first one kind of coined was modern day redlining, right? Because it is still happening today. So I just want to set up some context because nothing happens in a vacuum, right? Like this wasn't discovered post 2000. This goes back years, and this has been happening for more than 50 years, right? So I think we are all familiar, most of us are familiar with these maps, the HOLC maps, the redlining maps that showed that like where lenders should invested or could invested, and this was encouraged by the federal government. It was legalized, it was encouraged, it was something that the lending institutions built their practices upon, right? So the red means hazardous, the more risk, the most credit risk associated to those neighborhoods, green is the best. And the thing that we all know here is that the red is primarily Black and immigrant communities, where the green ones, the ones that are the best to lend to, were those who were white at the time. And it was founded in Chicago. This is a map of Chicago. But not only did it happen in Chicago, it happened nationally. Here is the San Diego map. As you can see, there's Balboa Park, and everything southeast of Balboa Park was labeled as a hazardous credit risk, meaning that lenders were not supposed to lend there, or should not lend there. And so that was legal to about the 1968, when the Fair Housing Act was implemented, and it made redlining, it was supposed to make redlining illegal, but the practice has still been happening today, even though we're 50 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act. And so my colleagues and I at Reveal, one of my former news organizations that I was at back in 2008, published a story called Kept Out. And the genesis of this story was 10 years. The central question that we started asking ourselves is 10 years after the housing bust, the 2008 housing crisis, why, if we were 10 years out of the bust, why do people feel stuck in terms of building financial wealth? And as many of you know, in this country, wealth is certainly tied to home ownership. And those people who have access to homes or buying homes are inherently a lot wealthier than those who rent, right? And then it's also generational, meaning that like you are more likely to own a home if your parents own a home, or the wealth can then be passed on from your parents, grandparents, whoever has owned a home in your family, a previous generation, on to those who are looking to buy a home in the next generation, right? And so we kept hearing this narrative from people that people felt stuck in terms of building wealth 10 years after the housing bust. And so we started looking at homes and home ownership and who has access to home ownership. And what we found is that it is not distributed equitably, that people of color are more likely to be shut out of their of home ownership. And we focused the story on this woman in Philadelphia. Her name was Rochelle Ferrul. She tried to buy a home. She tried three different times. The first one, she was told that she did not have consistent enough income. She was working part-time. No, she was working as a contractor, teaching computer programming at Rutgers University. So the lender said she did not have consistent enough income. So she tried again. The second time, when in preparation for the second time, she switched jobs working at UPenn, managing $1 million grant. And this time she was told that it was an unpaid electric bill from years ago in New York. And that was the reason she was not going to get a mortgage, that unpaid electric bill on her credit history. She decided to try once more, this time bringing on her half Asian, half white partner who worked part-time at a grocery store, making, I think, $140 a week. And Rochelle paid her partner's health insurance at the time, right? So Rochelle was was a main income breadwinner of their family. And it wasn't until her partner came on that seemed to kind of change the attitude of lenders. Rochelle was able to get a mortgage only after her partner came on. And so this kind of Rochelle's story kind of encapsulates the story that we found in Philadelphia, but not only Philadelphia, but also just nationwide. We found that in Philadelphia, Black applicants were almost 3 times as likely to be denied conventional mortgages than their white counterparts. So even when they made the same amount of money, tried to take out the same sized loan, live in a similar situated neighborhood, and among other financial characteristics, that still Black applicants were more likely to more likely to be denied. And so that wasn't only specific to Philadelphia, but we found it in 61 major metropolitan areas where even after controlling for income, the loan amount, certain neighborhood characteristics, Black applicants and other applicants of color were more likely to be denied than similarly qualified white applicants. And this was happening in 2018. And so what the lender, so we took this analysis before we published and shared it with the lending industry, specifically the Mortgage Bankers Association. They told us we did not have sufficient enough data to make a true determination about fair lending, right? They specifically cited that our analysis lacked credit score, it lacked debt to income ratio, and it lacked combined loan to value ratio. They said those three variables, those three metrics are what lenders use to decide their decisions. That race plays no role in their decisions whatsoever, and that if someone gets denied, it's because of credit score, debt to income ratio, and combined loan to value ratio. That is what they told us. So it's basically everything that you did not have is the reason why people of color are denied loans, right? And I think the important thing to understand is we relied on publicly available data for this. The Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data set, which is like loan level data. It lists every loan application in the country for a given year, and it gets down to the granular information like on census tract, right? So you can see who is getting loans in what neighborhoods down to the census tract level and the race of the applicant, how much they're making, the loan amount, and marry it with census data so you can see demographic data. And this is all public information, but lenders have done a good job of trying to keep the most important variables outside from getting into this public version of the data set. And that was their argument, their pushback, that it was like basically everything you don't have and everything you cannot get, like credit scores, debt to income ratio, combined loan to value ratio. Those are the reasons why people of color are denied loans at higher rates. And you just have to take our word for it. So the HMDA data wasn't very complete at the time when I first worked on this, published the story in 2018. But something changed towards I think 2019, a year later. The CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the federal agency that keeps and maintains this data, they decided to expand and publicly release more data. So now what they were including and was publicly available to anyone who cares about this data and mortgage and home ownership and cares about redlining, like now they could see things like debt to income ratio and combined loan to value ratio. Some of the things that they did decide to keep away were credit scores and the decisions made by the underwriting algorithms. Those are information that the government does collect and the government does ask lenders for, but the government has decided that it does not want to publicly release those pieces of information. CFPB has determined that like they are citing privacy concerns as a reason why they're not publicly disclosing credit scores. But there's a lot more information available now than there was ever before. So once I found out that this information was now public, I decided to kind of take a stab at the story again, at the analysis again. One of the driving factors here when I switched over to working at the markup from my previous organization at Reveal was, were the lenders right? Does debt to income ratio and combined loan to value ratio, do those things explain away the lending disparities like lenders said they would? And so I reran the analysis all over again and found that they do not, that holding those things constant do not erase lending disparities. And so I found that nationally, uh, applicants of color are still more likely to be denied. Even when they make the same amount of money, when they have similar debt ratios, when they make a similar size down payment, when all these things are equal, Black people are still more likely to be denied conventional home loans than their white counterparts. And the graphic that we used to illustrate was this one, where, right, if we have 100 similar applicants at each race, 5 white applicants would be denied, but then that means an additional 4 Black applicants would be denied. And those 4 Black applicants would have the similar financial characteristics as their white counterparts. And you can see that it is true for Latino, Asian Pacific Islander, and Native American applicants. And these are the national rates, something that I was not able to do last time around because of the limitations of the data. But because the data is a lot better this time around, it really highlighted how pervasive redlining is. It is even true in San Diego, where Latino and Asian Pacific Islanders showed statistically significant results, and Black and Native American applicants may not be showing up, not because they may not be facing discrimination, but because the sample size may be small enough, as is the case with Native American applicants, or I need to be able to look at different types of loans given the areas for that particular racial or ethnic group. So just because a racial or ethnic group isn't on this list does not mean that they don't experience any type of discrimination. And so I found it for 89 metros this time around with the analysis, where 89 metros where people of color are more likely to be denied, right? And they range, right, from places in the South, places in the Northeast, Midwest, and out into most liberal places like California, right? Like, redlining is a national issue. It has been since the 30s, and it continues to be a problem that people of color, particularly Black aspiring homeowners, continue to face. One of the things that lenders said this time around again was that you don't have credit score. Credit score is the reason why applicants of color are more likely to be denied home loans, not their race. But then I found this, we recreated this graphic, this study from the CFPB. They looked at credit score alone, and they found that credit score alone does not completely erase the lending disparities between white and applicants of color. Right, and I think that is something noteworthy, because lenders have always said that credit score forms the backbone of lending, right? That is the risk score that shows how well does someone repay their loan back. And as you can see, there are still disparities, regardless of if people have the same credit score. People of color are more likely to be denied than their white counterparts given the same credit score. So credit score alone does not erase these disparities. And a lot of these disparities have to do, we are moving in more into an algorithmic state of things, where algorithms are making the decisions instead of people, right? Because people, what algorithms bring is being able to make decisions quickly at bulk. And in the case of lenders, right, they want to be able to make the most money, make the most loans, get the most return on, so they turn to algorithms. And while there's still a human element in the lending decisions, right, algorithms are taking up a bigger and bigger space. The problem, though, with algorithms and data is that people often think that algorithms and data are neutral, are objective. Like they hide behind that it is this software that's doing it, this race neutral software, right? But I think the thing that we have to understand is that the algorithms are a recipe, are an equation, and it is based on data from the past, And there's this argument that says that algorithms aren't necessarily predictive of the future, but repeat the past. And so the reason why we have to take that into account is if we are using bad data to begin with, then we are going to produce bad results. A lot of the issues, a lot of the decision making, a lot of the things that hinge upon whether someone gets a mortgage or not have to do with historically redlining outcomes or principles, right? Like property values, for example, or assets. Redlining was legal to like the 1960s. That is one generation ago. And so if my friends' parents who are Black, they could not get a loan, their grandparents could not get a loan to get a house, then my peers who are Black are going to struggle with intergenerational wealth. And then that intergenerational wealth becomes a signal in terms of for the algorithm to decide who gets a loan and who doesn't. And so it's important to understand that like what you're feeding the algorithm, what you're telling the algorithm is important, is a determinant in terms of the outcome, has a disparate impact on people's lives. So we published this story in August of 2000, last year, 2001, and we've produced some sort of impact. One of the first things that when we started asking Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac about whether their algorithm produces disparate impacts on people of color when it comes to home ownership and getting loans, one of the things that a few months after we started asking questions, they published this press release saying that they would start incorporating rent payments in their mortgage deciding algorithms. And the reason why that's important is because people who pay rent, their rent payments aren't necessarily reflected on their credit scores, right? Credit scores, again, is like, that's what lenders say they base their decisions on. And so if you're making rent payments all the time and you have like that 1 month because of pandemic, because someone gets sick where you can't make rent, that rent payment is that late payment is going to show up on your credit score, and it's only going to be the one that shows up on your credit score, right? And versus if you own a mortgage, like you have that one late payment, but it's balanced off by those other like 99 on-time payments. And so from the people that I've spoke to, the housing advocates, they like this change, but felt that Fannie Mae could be doing more in terms of just making things more equitable. The Justice Department, the OCC, and the CFPB also launched a new redlining initiatives to combat like the behavior of lenders. And that was something that wasn't taken seriously by the previous administration. They used the story to show why this is important, why their initiatives are important. And also, I think the CFPB is looking into reviewing the HMDA data and looking into possibly releasing credit scores, right? Which is the last pillar that the lending industry, that banks, lenders can hide behind in terms of why these lending disparities exist, as opposed to saying that like, oh, maybe there is something wrong with the way we assess risk, or maybe there's something that like something is happening why these lending disparities exist, right? So credit score may become more of a public basing point in the data set. And so with that, I will open it up to questions. If you all have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. That's a really fantastic presentation, and really kind of does a nice bit of level setting on sort of where we are from kind of a data-driven perspective. We are going to have, I think, a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And so, certainly want to encourage all of our participants to please put their questions in the chat. As a follow-up, I just wanted to kind of ask, we have seen increasingly out in the market kind of the rise of sort of online sort of, like lenders who are providing mortgages to prospective homeowners. I'm thinking off the top of my head about folks like, like Rocket Mortgages. Those are some of the folks who I've seen ads for. Are their outcomes included in your data sets? And if they are, or if they're not, do you see any difference in terms of how those arm's length lenders might be treating some of these populations that we've been working with?
Yeah, so those are like the national numbers include all types of lenders, right? So we have banks, we have credit unions, and we have independent mortgage companies, including the ones that are online. So they are all kind of show that representative of this problem. There have been studies that show that some online bankers, some that depend on algorithms, are a little better in terms of the yes/no decision, the denial versus the approval of the loan, but they still struggle in being fair in terms of the pricing. There was a study done at UC Berkeley that shows that. And then I've also seen, on the flip side of that, there's also been this other work that shows that online lenders are much worse at capturing the race variables of their applicants, right? And in terms of like showing how well the improvements or lack thereof in terms of access to home ownership, race is an important variable to capture. And so if you're not capturing the data, then you probably can't really assess if there's an improvement or not in terms of making homeownership more equitable. So it's a very double-edged sword here in terms of how online lenders are participating in or not fomenting the disparities.
Got it. So that is good context to have, to know that sort of the data includes sort of all of those lenders of different varieties. We've got a couple of questions that are coming into the chat. I'm going to hold off on those until we get to the end a little bit, and pivot now from sort of our kind of current state of affairs from kind of a national and local perspective to sort of hear what the San Diego Foundation is sort of working on as part of their sort of new Black homeowner initiative around their sort of efforts at kind of tackling this challenge. So Pamela, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll be excited to hear what you've got to present.
Well, thanks. Thank you again. Listening to Emmanuel just really reminded me of why we are here, why the San Diego Foundation has engaged in this work. The San Diego Foundation has existed for 47 years. We will soon celebrate our 50th anniversary. And never before have we entered into the homeownership space until recently. And I will admit that it was largely prompted by the injustices that we were seeing in 2020 as it related to George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. The San Diego Foundation, like so many community foundations around the country, were asking ourselves, what are we doing to address injustice, inequity in our communities? And though we had been doing quite a bit at that point, largely because of our COVID Community Response Fund, to really ensure that all communities were being supported through their COVID relief efforts, through the nonprofits in those communities, we also realized that there was a real problem locally as it related to inequities based on race. And so looking at the African-American community and how we had supported the African-American community, it was an opportunity for us to work with partners across the region, pull together a group of people to say, what could the foundation do that would actually have an impact long-term? So we knew that there were some short-term immediate needs, but what could we really do to change the outcomes of lives in our region for African-American San Diegans? And when we did that and said, well, what then are the disparities that are most impacting people's access to financial security? There were a couple of things that came to mind. I'm so sorry. And there were 4 disparities that we wanted to address. And those 4 disparities were education, employment and workforce training, entrepreneurship, and homeownership. And with each of those, we had this wonderful group of advisory council members. It only wants to do this now because I'm talking to all of you. We have this wonderful group of advisory council members that came together and said, well, we'll help you figure this out. And so with the homeownership piece, we decided that we would invest $1 million ourselves in seeding a homeownership, a first-time homebuyer program. And in order to do that, we reached out to partners, Ricardo Flores, who I mentioned earlier at LISC, the Urban League San Diego, and Union Bank initially, to partner with us on this initiative. And with this initiative, we decided that, knowing that what we're trying to build is long-term generational wealth, that homeownership is really the key, as Emmanuel has already shared with you, and I know that all of you know this well. We recognize that if we could give borrowers money towards their down payment, many of the problems that people have in San Diego, and particularly at that time, was the cost of living here is very high. And if you do not have a family member who has owned a home and has the ability to use equity in that home to give you support to purchase your first home, that if you're paying a lot in rent and just the cost of living in San Diego, the probability of your having had the opportunity to save the money that was necessary to put down on that first down payment was unlikely. And so if we could do anything to help people close the gap between what they were able to save and what they really needed to put down on that first home, we would be able to make an impact on the lives of some borrowers. And so through the initiative so far, we have assisted 19 buyers who are now in their home as a result of a grant that they're receiving from the San Diego Foundation of $40,000, money that is being contributed by the lender, Union Bank, and access to other resources that are available in the state, such as wish dollars, to help them put down on that home. 19 borrows may not seem like a lot if we were in many other states and counties, but in San Diego, we do see that as being a significant start. Our hope is that in this first year, we'll actually reach 35 buyers and want to expand the program into future years with fundraising. And so, again, it has really just been rewarding, but also just a reminder that there have been injustices that are deeply seated in our communities that have made this program that much more important, perhaps even long overdue, but unfortunate that it's necessary. That if everyone had the opportunity to purchase homes in the 1940s, in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, because redlining was not existent, there would be more equity across the county for families of color, Black families in particular right now, to share and to help other family members invest in those homes. We are not able to go back and fix the injustices of the past, but we do believe that this program is helping us to address the injustices today. And we're very proud of that work and are really hoping to see the stories that develop long-term about the impact of this investment.
Thank you so much, Pamela. The work that you and the San Diego Foundation are doing are really, it sounds like, are really around sort of trying to mitigate kind of the ripple effects of sort of the structural racism that has affected our communities, and then looking at sort of how that has sort of how that is reflecting itself as really an access issue for the communities that we're trying to serve. Just to your point, we don't have sort of legal redlining anymore, but those effects from a socioeconomic perspective are still being felt. When you're thinking about the programs that the San Diego Foundation is going to be working on, and this Black home buyer program. Is this affected by some of your past sort of, like work experience? You've spent time, like working at Rise and at the Kim Center. I'm wondering how those experiences might affect sort of how this program is perhaps being put together and sort of who you're hoping to reach.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Coffee. My involvement in the community has been longstanding. I've been, a part of some really important organizations in San Diego, in my view, that are addressing equity from different perspectives. The Kim Center focuses on gender equity. Rise San Diego is really lifting up the voice of people of color and developing this entirely new community of leaders in our region, people who represent the communities that they come from. And so as the San Diego Foundation was asking ourselves, after the social unrest in May, June of 2020, how are we going to respond to that? It really was an opportunity to reflect on what we had done up until that point, but more so where we thought we could go, and really through the work that we do, which is inspiring philanthropy. So through inspiring philanthropy, what would our donors and lenders and foundations that are supporting our work support? And so we have been really pleased to see the level of support across all sectors for this work. I think for many people, there just was no awareness of the need. They didn't really understand the history. And so educating people about redlining and the impact on redlining in San Diego, they thought perhaps redlining existed in the South, or redlining existed in a particular community, but surely it wasn't a factor here in San Diego. And in fact, it very much is the reason that many people of color, particularly Black families, live south of the 94 and have for generations. And if you understand that, it inspires you, I hope, to do better. It has certainly inspired us to do better and to be much more intentional around our programs and developing programs that are responding to real live situations and needs in our community. Because, as an organization that says we are advocating for just equitable, resilient communities, we can't leave home ownership to those who only can afford it and have always been able to afford it. That if we're really committed to just equitable and resilient communities, we have to be willing to dive into some of those complex issues that are going to be expensive to really change the outcome of families and lives in our region so that everyone is able to prosper. It has not always been the case, and it's time that changes. And I think the conversations that we're having today and so many others in our region are really going to, I believe, create that momentum that is needed to really address the issues of affordable housing, access to housing, safe housing, changing communities, providing more resources for students and youth, improving the quality of schools for kids, giving them access to all of the different benefits that should be part of living in San Diego, because it is rich in so many ways.
This is a conversation that's been a long time coming, and it's super exciting to see groups like the San Diego Foundation taking sort of an intentional role and a thoughtful approach and trying to attack these things sort of proactively. It's going to take those resources as well as sort of the thought partnership and leadership from folks like Emmanuel to be able to help us think through these problems. It's the only way we're going to make progress. So really gratified to hear sort of you guys are taking these steps and sort of, getting in the fight. Very exciting. Yeah, thank you so much.
I do see a question, and I know we'll get to questions later,
Sure.
but I could just offer a little bit more on the Black home buyer program. The average purchase price is somewhere in the low 400,000s, and most of those homes are going to be condos for the buyer. We are maxed out at 120% of AMI, and so just based on that and what families can afford, it has been the case so far that most of the buyers are single individuals. There have been a few families One, I think, is a 4 or 5 person family, another a 2 person family, but most of the buyers have been single, which has been interesting to us. But I think it has a lot to do with where are they able to find homes that are affordable. And for families with children, it's, if you're at 120% of AMI, given the current market, which an average single family home being $855,000 right now, it doesn't get them close enough to being able to buy and buy those homes that they're most interested in for their families.
No, Pamela, I think you've really kind of laid out the real challenge there, particularly for our region, with the home prices getting up into the $700,000 and $800,000 range. It's really a matter of just economic access and even being able to approach any of those numbers. So having a down payment assistance program that's working flexibly with home buyers of different kinds and types, critical. Yeah, really exciting.
Thank you.
So I'm going to pivot now to giving a little bit of a brief presentation around sort of habitat, and then we'll at the end have a chance to go through some of the questions that have been piling up in the chat, and we'll have that along with a couple of other Q&As for our panelists. So I'm going to talk relatively briefly about sort of one about sort of Habitat's current work, and what I'm also hoping to do is to sort of highlight the fact that even though we as Habitat have some advantages as to how we approach some of these fair housing issues, we still have to take a really intentional approach to ensure that our outcomes look the way that we want them to. So with that, I'm going to attempt to share my screen and not have something crazy happen. Let's see. Can everybody see my screen? If Pamela or Emmanuel, if you can see it, I think you'd be the folks who I'd be able to hear from.
Yes.
Just sort of, perfect. Okay, all right. That is encouraging because I'm always nervous that it's going to look nuts. All right. So I'm the president and CEO of San Diego Habitat. We'll just get past that. About us, just as a brief review, San Diego Habitat is the local affiliate chapter of Habitat for Humanity. And we specialize in building homes for working families that will be owned by those homeowners. In order to perform our mission, and frankly, in order to make the economics work, we rely on a mix of volunteer and we rely on a mix of sweat equity from our prospective homeowners and from sweat equity that is contributed by our volunteers. We also rely on a mix of public sector and philanthropic partnerships, i.e. contributions, because we've got to bridge that gap between sort of the $700,000 and $800,000 home price that we have out there and what a working family in San Diego can realistically afford. And the homeowners that we typically serve are in that 80% of the area median income range. So for a family of 4, that's about $85,000 to $90,000 of annual income, just to kind of give people sort of a rough picture. One of the things that differentiates us, and it's relevant, I think, to this conversation around sort of fair housing and mortgages, is that Habitat in most cases is the originator of our own mortgages. So we are the ones making those lending decisions. We then hold those mortgages, and typically we'll have a right to repurchase the homes at the end of the mortgage or whenever our homeowner wants to sell their home. So we're directly involved not only in the building of the home, but also in the financing of it and the providing of the mortgage for our homeowners. So how it works, our mortgage payments create a revolving fund, which we then use to build more homes. Our homeowners have to qualify for that mortgage. So we have our own internal criteria that we use, always in compliance with the fair housing rules. And we also are working with our volunteers and our homeowners in order to try to control those costs. Just very briefly, and I know this will be review, I wanted to talk a little bit about why we think home ownership is so important in the context of affordable housing. I've been working in affordable housing for the last, 10 or 15 years now. But home ownership really does provide a pathway to permanent affordability. If somebody owns their home and they have a mortgage that's fixed, that gives them the gives them the power and ability to sort of plan out and anticipate sort of what their housing costs are going to be. It's also kind of a proven fact that along with home ownership, there is an element of financial stability that comes with that sort of that kind of comes with that predictability. You know how much your monthly housing costs should look like. There are also a set of sort of well understood sort of intangible benefits, both from sort of an educational outcome perspective for the children who get to live in home ownership situations, and a set of improved, like housing and health outcomes. So these are things that I think as an affordable housing community, we've all sort of been coming to understand over the last few years. So I won't delve too far into it. There are some safety benefits that we've also found that come with home ownership. When we have polled some of our homeowners, what we have found is that they are significantly less likely to be involved with sort of be involved with sort of be involved with negative violent crime situations. The other outcome that's been really exciting is there's an increased sense of independence that we think comes from some of this sort of financial strength that they're building up over the course of their home ownership experience. And then lastly, and I think this is the one that's probably the best understood, we like to talk about home ownership at Habitat as a one-time investment that has a generational that has a generational ripple effect. The reality is that homeowners enjoy about a 400% higher net worth than similarly situated renters. And that's something that we think should be available and should be an access issue for all prospective homeowners, for all folks working in San Diego. It shouldn't be something that is, really, I think limited to those homeowners that are making six-figure incomes that can afford $700,000 and $800,000 homes. When your starter home in your community costs $700,000 or $800,000, you're really locking out large swaths of the population. And from a fair housing perspective, what you're effectively doing is cutting out large numbers of people of color and historically disadvantaged groups who may have been affected by redlining or who haven't been able to build up the same kind of wealth as perhaps some of our other communities. So getting back to sort of what that access issue looks like and sort of how it plays out, what we know is that only about 41% of Black Californians and about 49% of Latino Californians are homeowners. And we contrast that with almost 70% of white families in the same state. So at Habitat, we've managed to sort of inverse those numbers a little bit. About 70% of the homeowners who purchase a home from Habitat are people of color. And so what I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about is how we've managed to achieve that. It isn't just that we originate our own mortgages. We have to actually take some steps to try to make this happen because there are a series of other challenges that are out there beyond simply sort of what's restricted in the numbers. Just as a picture, it isn't just here. It isn't just our Habitat affiliate here in San Diego. This slide shows a breakdown of sort of what our home buyers look like, both statewide and locally. And so we like to think that this is a stronger sort of reflection of what our community actually looks like. We're particularly proud of the percentage of our homeowners that are Latino. But the question is, how do we achieve that, right? It helps that we originate our own mortgages, but we have to also take some intentional steps. And there's really sort of a four-part strategy that Habitat has developed, and it's something that I think has been worked on sort of nationwide. But those principles are: first, you want to try to eliminate language as a barrier. Buying a home can be a complicated process, and it can be scary, particularly for first-time home buyers. So making an effort around having bilingual employees and folks who can do that outreach is really critical for us. Here in San Diego, obviously, Spanish is going to be first and second in terms of the types of languages that we want to be really focused on, but there are a range of others, whether it be Tagalog or some of our other sub-Saharan languages. We try to maintain resources that enable us to go out and touch those communities. The other reality is that we have to acknowledge our own sort of shortcomings and rely on partnerships. Partnerships are one of the only ways that you're going to be able to reach some of these, like ethnographic communities, particularly in a place as diverse as San Diego. So we're relying on our partnerships, not only with groups centered in those communities, but also some of our longtime public sector and philanthropic partners. So that's the that includes the Urban League and the San Diego Housing Commission, and frankly, some of our other nonprofit housing partners. In addition to that, you have to also consider beyond language, there can be cultural and religious gaps. People from other communities may view things a little bit differently, and that can be based on some of sort of where they come from and sort of how they understand the world to work. You have to sort of value that diversity and sort of sit in those places and be willing to have those conversations. And sometimes that takes time and frankly, a lot of staff effort. And then I think lastly, you have to try to value diversity, not just externally in terms of how you work, but also internally. I like to think that I'm a reflection of sort of our organization's commitment around that. But San Diego Habitat has been a CHODO for many, many years. That means a third of our board is supposed to be and really attempts to be sort of reflective of the communities that we serve. So our board has a high proportion of sort of has a pretty high proportion of folks who are actual Habitat homeowners who sit on our board. We think that both grounds our approach as a staff and really helps us think creatively and intentionally about how we're going to reach the communities that we are dedicated towards serving. But increasing access isn't just about who you can outreach to and how you do that work. It's also frankly going to be about getting the price points down to where people can afford it. And so much like with the Black Homebuyer program, you might have heard Pamela mention that many of their loans are going out for sort of like townhomes and attached condos. That's going to be a bigger part of our strategy going forward. Really is going to be about trying to decrease the per unit costs so that we can increase the number of homeowners who are going to get an opportunity to first buy their home and second, build the wealth and get all of the other attendant benefits that we all know comes from homeownership. So for us, we're going to be looking more and more at increasing our economies of scale and really thinking about what are some other innovative strategies that we can use to really make sure that we don't just build a detached single family home in an area where perhaps three or four units could potentially sit. If we can increase the number of units that sit on a lot, we can decrease that home size, or rather we can decrease that home price and hopefully offer this opportunity to more families. So that's something that we will be looking at more and more. But finally, for us, as you've heard probably throughout my presentation, partnership for us really is the key. Partnership around both sort of our financial resources, both in terms of our philanthropic partners and also our public sector partners. We're also really excited about the fact that many of our public sector partners and frankly the folks who are out there are coming more and more to the table or sort of around this conversation around affordable home ownership and increasing access for populations that have not traditionally been involved in these conversations. And so that's really a part of what we see as kind of a larger sort of shift in the conversation around affordable housing that has been ongoing in our region. I think there are conversations around both density and equity and subjects that perhaps weren't given as much sort of attention, at least in the past 10 or 12 years that I've been looking at affordable housing here in San Diego, that are now kind of coming to the fore. And then I think lastly, working on sort of how we can think about land and how we use land in the context of building out our affordable housing and affordable home ownership are some of the really exciting things that we've been hearing from our partners. And so we're excited about all of those things. I want to thank you for listening to my presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn this off and we'll get into the Q&A. Turn off the share button. I can do this. I know I can. How do I do that? Stop share. All right. Is everybody back? I can see you, Pamela. Emmanuel, are you there? We lost anybody?
Yeah, I'm here.
Wonderful. Okay. All right. So with that, I'm going to take a little bit of time to maybe pose a couple of questions that were placed in the chat. One of them that I thought was sort of interesting, and it's kind of a baseline question, and it's sort of for you, Emmanuel, it's got kind of a historical context, is that Why exactly is it that mortgage lenders are allowed to ask about people's race? How did that come to be? Why is that a thing?
Yeah, I mean that is a very good question, and the intention of the asking for people's race is for transparency reasons, right? When redlining was happening from the 30s to the late 60s, right? Lenders could do whatever they want. And when the Fair Housing Act happened, um, a lot of community activists still felt in Chicago, at least still felt it was happening, still felt that lenders were discriminating against people of color, against Black people, in ways that that lenders weren't being held accountable to, and in ways that they could skirt the Fair Housing Act. And so one of the things that community activists in Chicago did was start collecting data on lenders and where they were lending to. And that started what is known as the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. And basically what that law says is that lenders have to give all this information, all these data points to the government. And that includes the race of the borrower, the race and ethnicity of the borrower, of the applicant. And in order to hold lenders accountable, to make sure they are meeting the needs of the communities they are serving. And that data set has improved year after year. It has included more data points than when it first started. I think when it first started, it was mostly like location data. And now it's looking at at specific information of the applicant, the loan, the size of the loan, the lender making it. So it's all in the name of transparency and making sure that lenders are being fair and equitable in the way that they give loans to people.
That's really helpful. So it's sort of one of those exercises of kind of what gets measured is what gets worked on.
Right, yes.
Okay, all right, well, that's excellent background. Want to shift a little bit over to you, Pamela. You've been working in and around San Diego for a while, and Emmanuel, obviously, you're relatively new to San Diego, so if you've got something to add here, please feel free. But Pamela, wanted to get your take on sort of what do you think are some of the barriers to access that have been affecting some of the communities that we've been serving? We've talked a little bit about them, but I'm wondering, in the communities, as you've been sort of working on this program, what do you think are some of the barriers that have kind of kept coming up that you're kind of identifying as things that need to get worked on?
Something that RISE has been working on is developing leadership within the community, so that the voices that are being heard are voices that are deeply rooted in community, and they are able to best carry forth the message of what their needs are, of the challenges that they're facing, issues of access. They're going to best represent that. And I think part of the reason an organization like RISE San Diego was created is because that representation was not there. And so those voices were often disparate and not heard. And trying to develop acknowledging that the problems there are a plethora of issues in many of our communities, but having the leadership and the representation that is focused on individual issues and needs is challenging, because there are so many. A single council representative can't represent all of the needs of a community when there are so many of them. But if we can have that representative supported by other leaders from the community and amplifying the message and the needs of what is really pressing on our communities, I think we're likely to see more attention devoted to those needs, attention and resources. And I think as I just reflect back, I started my career many years ago working in City Hall at San Diego, working for a council representative. And it really, tended to be those voices that got the most attention were the loudest. And when you are facing so many challenges, it's not easy to be the loudest because there are so many things that you want to accomplish.
So really it's a challenge about both getting a seat at the table and then also balancing all of the competing needs so that each one has a chance to be heard and potentially get met. I mean, yeah.
I believe that's very true. And I think, part of the problem as well is just the resources, or the lack of resources. As long as Emmanuel has pointed out, and you as well, Coffee, through the work that you're doing with Habitat, the value of homes south of 8 and south of 94 are not as valuable as homes in other parts of our community. So if we're generating resources based on the tax base of the value of a home, you're going to not have as much to work with. And that continues to be an impediment to our communities.
Emily, you raise a couple of really interesting points, and I want to come back to that conversation around sort of home values in certain geographies being perhaps viewed a bit differently, and perhaps some of the causes on that. So I do want to come back to that, but I also want to hit a little bit on with your experience sort of with the city, and this is also for you, Emmanuel. What are some things that you think public sector partners, cities, counties could be doing to help improve access to affordable home ownership opportunities for these disadvantaged communities? I have some thoughts on it as well, so I'll of course wanting to be tacked myself on, but I wanted to kind of get your thoughts first. What are some things, Pamela, that you think cities and counties could potentially be doing?
You hit on several of those. Lowering the cost of land. We're spending so much money on the cost of land, and then adding to that structures. As you pointed out, if a plot of land is going to be used for 2 homes, could we make that plot 4 homes? Adding height and of course density, but it does provide more accommodations for people in need. And we've lost a lot of homes in San Diego recently to more expensive, high-rise properties, particularly in the downtown area. And I'm not, I don't have all the data on that, but I see anecdotally what's happening. I worked in housing a long time ago, and we had a lot of single room occupancy homes or places in the downtown area of San Diego, and they don't exist anymore. Mm-hmm. And so where did those residents go? Many of them are now living on the streets. And we have to do better at balancing the needs of our community, all residents, who are working hard in many cases every day and still unable to afford the cost of housing for their families, and the needs of developers who want to be able to make a profit on their work. I understand that as well, but there has to be a place where we're all coming together and acknowledging that these problems are so big, they can only be resolved when all parties are working together, and that be government, public and private sector, individuals, bringing everyone to the table to acknowledge that this is a county-wide issue, and it's going to take the efforts of all of us working collaboratively to find solutions. And I'm all for nothing should be thrown off the table. I think we've got to be innovative. We've got to be willing to try things that we haven't tried before, make investments that we've not made before in order to really bring solutions that are going to be enduring for generations to come. Otherwise, what I see happening is people, young Black people, for example, who are educated, they're leaving. They're not growing in San Diego. If we look at the Black population in San Diego, it's decreasing. So,
Pamela, I think that's really well put. It's going to take, I think, everybody to try to pitch in and find some of these solutions. And, for a region that's short by 140,000 or some, affordable housing units, I would say that excluding any particular solution set would perhaps be a bad idea. Emmanuel, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of what your experience has led you to maybe led you to around what sort of cities and counties and perhaps public sector partners could be doing around some of these conversations, either from a service or resource perspective, or maybe even from a regulatory perspective. Just so what are some of the roles that they could potentially be playing that could be helpful?
And yeah, I based this decision or this answer on, I think, some of the responses that local governments have had to the reporting that I've done. For example, in Philadelphia, when we published that story back in February 2018, what this city of Philadelphia did was they launched a down payment assistance program for people, right? Like, I think when it comes to getting a mortgage, one of the biggest barriers is that down payment is that 5% up to 20% down payment. And especially if you live in California, right, that could be an astronomical amount of money given the high cost of homes here in California. And so that is what the city of Philadelphia did. They also launched this other program that helped prospective applicants of color have a second review at their application in the event that they were denied by a lender, right? That is another pair of eyes that could be like, something is funny going on here. Something shouldn't have happened that did happen in this application process. Because one of the things that I saw in my reporting, especially as it came to the Black woman, Rochelle, who was denied the second time because of an unpaid electric bill, we managed to find all these white applicants that had the same problem, but the lenders were able to excuse that unpaid utility bill for the white applicants. But for the Black applicant, that was the end of the conversation, right? So Philadelphia launched this program to give a second review. The other thing that I saw happen was, I forget, it was up in New York. I want to say, I don't remember the county or city, but in New York, for context, we reported that TD Bank in Philadelphia had no bank branches in majority Black neighborhoods, right? And what does that mean for people, for applicants of color, particularly Black people, investing or getting resources from banks when they are not physically present in their neighborhood, right? And there's this notion that says that Black people of color, don't trust them. Well, how can you trust something if it's not present in your neighborhood? And so as a result of that, there was this local government that decided to pool its funds from TD Bank as a way of like, we are not going to do business with you because this is your track record working with communities of color. And so those are some of the things that I saw local governments, local stakeholders do in response to the redlining work that I've done. I don't know if those are actual solutions, but those have been some of the responses that I have seen.
Got it. And Emmanuel, I want to come right back to you with a follow-up question, but I want to just quickly sort of add that sort of from Habitat for Humanity's perspective, some of the things that we think our local governments and some of our partners could be continuing to sort of help us with is, one, providing some of the subsidy and resources that's needed to sort of bridge, just to sort of bridge that bridge that financing gap. The reality is that we're trying to sell something that the market says costs $750,000 to $850,000 at a price that's affordable to families that make $90,000. So any additional support that we can get that helps us backfill that capital stack is critical. The other reality too is that when we can work with our local governments and sort of the left hand knows what the right hand is doing around sort of planning and entitlements and sort of, acknowledging that on the one side of, perhaps that, public sector house, there's an investment being made. And so therefore that project is being well thought of, that would be helpful as far as sort of getting through sort of those sort of necessary processes. I want to circle back to you, Emmanuel, a little bit. In your article, one of the things that sort of elicited kind of a wry laugh from me was that one of the ways that Rochelle was able to get her mortgage finally was by incorporating her partner onto her loan application, which is sort of, darkly humorous. For those of us out there who do not have a partner of a different race or background who we could add to our, loan application, I'm wondering, what are some of the resources that Rochelle perhaps tried to tap, or that homeowners, or rather prospective homeowners who can't get a loan, should be looking towards to try to get some relief? If they're confronted by what they think is a redlining situation, what are some of the tools or resources that are out there? That's a question that got asked in the chat, and I just want to make sure that we that we honored that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I think back to that example and I'm like, is it more apparent than that? And apparently no. I think one of there are the CFPB HUD, they take on complaints. So you can reach out to them. I don't know, they're supposed to hear this out. And I believe you'll probably have more success with this administration than the previous one. One of the things that you can also do is one of the things that people don't understand or people aren't told is to shop around when it is to get a mortgage. And one of the pieces of information that is available to people that may not know is that anyone can walk into a bank, a Wells Fargo, a Chase, a Citibank, a Bank of America, and ask the bank manager for their CRA report, their Community Reinvestment Act report. And basically what that tells you is that shows all the data all the loans that the bank has made all the loans that the bank has made and to whom they have made them to and where they are making them. That is public information and anyone has access to it. And so I could conceivably walk into the bank, not as a reporter, but as a person shopping for a home and be like, Citibank, let me see your track record to lending to people of color. And if I see something there that isn't suitable to me, or that I know that they have like a history of not making loans to people of color, or that Bank X has a history of not making loans to people of color, then that's probably not a bank that I want to be getting a mortgage from or denied from. So that is when knowledge is power, that is one of the things that you can easily obtain from them. And you can kind of watch the bank manager kind of squirm because like this is not a request that they get every day. And in that packet, you will see the complaints that people have made about their processes. That is, I think, one of the biggest access of information that is available to people that people may not know. And I would also suggest shop around. The thing that is so insidious about getting a mortgage is how the impact that it has on your credit score, right? And so you have, Rochelle, like often being in this country, like people tell you that perseverance pays off, but that is not the thing when it comes to credit scores and getting loan and getting money, right? The more you try, the more of a negative impact it has on your credit score. But you do have, I believe, a 45-day window to shop around where you can compare the terms of one loan to the other from lender Y to bank X and see what deal is best for you. And in that 45-day window, your credit score won't be negatively impacted. And so those are the things that I have learned that I've taken away from my reporting in terms of shop around and just collect the most information that you can on who you're doing business with.
Yeah, it kind of gets back to that point you're making about sort of knowledge being power. The more you know, the better you can sort of equip yourself to sort of navigate this process. Pamela, I don't know if you have anything to add on that or could move on to another question. Okay. One of the things you did raise, Pamela, and I want to get both of your thoughts on it, is sort of I'll just call it what it is, sort of the disparate values I think we see for sort of similarly situated homes in different geographies. I grew up south of the 8. I grew up in, like Oak Park, and my home was lovely and bucolic. There were kids playing out on the street, but when I would talk to my friends who lived in other part of lived in other parts of the city, they would talk about my home on 55th Street in Oak Park as if it was like, I don't know, like Escape from LA, like some sort of like dystopia. And but there's kids here playing and riding their bikes and stuff. I don't understand. As I've gotten older, I've come to realize that what plays a large part in this is the appraisal gap and sort of the disparate and unequal ways that these neighborhoods are viewed. I'm wondering how you think, Pamela and Emmanuel, that connects to the situation that we're seeing now in terms of how it's affected the ability of these homeowners to be able to maybe move on to another house or to be able to sort of build up some of that wealth. Pamela, any thoughts about the appraisal gap and its continuing effects?
I don't have a lot of information on that, coffee, but I am very aware of it and have read, whether it was Emmanuel's articles or others on this very real issue, and
Yeah.
have experienced it as a homeowner myself. But it is, again, all of these things are rooted in discrimination, and we've just got to do better.
Emmanuel, how about for you? It seems like one of these sort of process-based sort of realities that's having a set of really negative outcomes.
Yeah, I think the problem with this, with like redlining and housing, right? It's all so much interconnected with each other, and it all kind of builds on each other. And the reason why I say this is because property value is a thing that is used to assess whether someone gets a home or not, right? Because the bank, the lender, wants to make sure that they're going to get a return on their investment. And that means that you have to be very selective in terms of finding a property value that is worth money, that is going to be worth something, that is going to be a sound investment for you. And often, because of baked in discrimination, because of the ideas of who is risky and who is not, that certainly plays into property values, right? And the thing that, Kofi, that you said so eloquently is that, like, and I believe, Pamela, you touched on this too, that redlining legally from a government standpoint is illegal, right? Redlining is illegal, and you will like get fined. It is bad. We all know that. But the thing that hasn't necessarily changed is the sentiment that's still very pervasive today, or the effects that redlining produced haven't necessarily gone away. And so when we talk about property values, there was a study that I read once that showed that formerly redlined neighborhoods are still suffering in so many ways in terms of health disparities, property values, all these other negative impacts that haven't been necessarily addressed or fixed. And so when someone who is buying a home in a formerly redlined neighborhood then sees their property values be different from those neighborhoods that weren't formally redlining, that is certainly going to have an impact on that person, on that neighborhood. And it just creates this endless cycle that we've seen happen since the 30s that hasn't been really addressed or fixed.
Yeah, it gets back to the concept of those ripple effects of some of the historical sort of inequalities that our communities have faced. I want to ask you, Emmanuel, and this might be the last question on, unless a few more kind of coming from the chat. The great thing about your article, and I encourage everybody who hasn't read it to please take a look at it. It really focuses sort of on the outcomes, sort of what it is that our communities are experiencing at the end of the day in terms of their experience with, accessing credit and purchasing homes and building the wealth that we're talking about. The defenses for the status quo are really, at least to my ears, based around process. It's really around, well, we have a process and its outcomes are what they are, and it sort of is what it is. You've touched a little bit on some of the changes that you think could be made to the process. Could you restate those and maybe expand on them if you could, around what are some of the other sort of process tweaks that could be made that might result perhaps in some better outcomes, including things like improving some of those algorithms, or just some of the things that people should be kind of aware of that might improve some of the outcomes?
Right. Yeah, I think one of the things that Fannie and Freddie decided to do is include rent payments, right? Like, and I think that is so important to talk about, because rent is not necessarily easily reflected in terms of credit scores. And like in most cases, renting is more expensive than paying off a mortgage. And if you have always been on time in terms of making rent, then it's probably going to be most likely that you will also be on time and be a responsible mortgage payer. But but because of how the credit score algorithm works, usually rent is not a component in that. And so that disproportionately affects everyone who is an aspiring who is a current renter and aspiring homeowner. It's like they are not getting credit for that, for being on time with their rent. And so that is one aspect that is being included. That I think remains to be seen if it yields results or not. The biggest thing is also, I think philosophically, is how we gauge risk, or how this country decides to gauge risk, and the factors that go into that. And I think, and I understand that, right, lending someone money, large sums of money up to like $800,000, $1 million, that comes with a lot of risk, and people want to see that money back. But if the proxies that society uses to gauge risk are built on previous factors of discrimination, like redlining, like assets, property value, credit score, which has a disparate impact on people because of how it's calculated, then that is going to inherently say that these people who have disproportionately been denied access to homeownership in the past because of structural racism, then they are going to be disproportionately seen as inherently more risky, right? So I think it comes back to like this philosophical question of like, how do we assess risk in an equitable manner?
That conversation around assessing risk is it really resonates for me. I worked for many years as essentially a loan officer for LISC, making investments of capital that was aggregated through the Community Reinvestment Act, and thinking about what we were investing in and how and why. Part of our job at the CDFI was to stretch, to really try to think about what could be, but those traditional sort of credit risk factors always sort of played a role in making us perhaps more conservative than we should have been, which just perpetuated sort of the ripple effects of these sort of disadvantaged communities, things in terms of property values and the risk factors for the folks who we were working with. I'd like to Pamela, yeah.
I don't want to suggest that we figured this out with our small project, but I do think that having banking partners has been a key component to our ability to help move people into homes. And in this case, the work starts with the Urban League of San Diego working with buyers, helping buyers to get everything in order so that when they're presenting their package to the lender is given everything they need essentially to approve this loan and not assume more risk than they might on any other loan. And that has come through the partnership and the education piece that the San Diego Urban League is providing to the buyers. But we also have an important partner in Union Bank for this particular project, where Union Bank says, we want to be a part of this. We want to help get people into homes. And so we'll work with them and do whatever is needed to try and qualify them as we perhaps may not have otherwise expected them to do. But I think having banking institutions as partners and acknowledging this very large problem, right? There are systems that are broken, that need to change. Bringing the banking institutions in as partners and helping to solve together how to get people from renting to homeownership if that is their desire.
I think that's very well put, Pamela, and having Union Bank as part of this conversation, I think, is a reflection of how far it's really come. And I think both you and Emmanuel have talked a lot about sort of the historical effects, or rather the ongoing effects of this sort of historical inequality, and having this conversation, I think, get traction with partnerships like Union Bank, like the San Diego Foundation, really reflects, I think, the opportunity that's in front of us. I'd like to thank our panelists for their really thoughtful and intentional comments. You guys did a fantastic job. Thank you so much, Emmanuel. Thank you so much, Pamela. We're a little bit short on time, so I'm going to turn this back over to Steve Russell, but wanted to really acknowledge, I think, the great work that you guys have done here today. Thank you so much for helping further this conversation. Steve, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Kwafi. Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, Emmanuel. I have to say every year that I find a lot of inspiration in this conference, and you have contributed greatly this year to our learning and our inspiration for our work. So thank you for that. And I hope that we will all continue to be partners here in this space. I want to, so that is our thanks. I think everybody, I want to thank Kwafi as well for doing an incredible job, both as a panelist and moderator, who's just as hard on himself as he was on his guests. So that's a testimony there. I also want to thank again our sponsors, San Diego Housing Commission, Citibank, and Cal HFA, and our production partner, San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing. And I don't know, is Estella here still to say a few words? I'm not seeing her at the moment, but she may still have a chance to say something here. Let me just remind folks, that first of all, we really appreciate the partnership with the Regional Alliance for Fair Housing. It has absolutely been a high point each year when we do this conference for both organizations, I think. I will ask you to please complete your surveys. They're really important to us in terms of making sure that we are delivering the learning content that you need. We will ask you to rejoin us tomorrow for our next panels on rental assistance and on local government. So with that, I just want to thank you for sharing your time with us, and we look forward to seeing you again this morning. Oh, here's Estella, just in time. There we go. Estella, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephen. Let me say that as fair housing advocates and members of the community, we have the obligation to redress discrimination and invest in our community to ensure equal rights for all. Today, as we think back to the history of segregation, let's also look forward to the greatness of our country and the determination of our American people to reverse the challenges of discrimination. Our speakers today reminded us there are gaps in Black and Latino homeownership and the challenges. Let us remember that we can address and find solutions to unravel the systemic and structural racism that contributes to neighborhood segregation. We will end today, and we look forward to continuing our unraveling day of segregation for day 2. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great evening.